So, Igor Dukhan, pages 163 to 168. I hope you were, did you fly in last night or this morning?
Yes,
This morning. Thank you for
this morning I was flying, and last night I was moving by bus. So this morning I was flying at the seminar, I mean.
Oh, flying intellectually, yes, of course, we all are. We all are. Thank you.
His lectures of late 30s and didn't publish this time. The correlation is too, in my view, is too sensible. And as in other cases, it seems to me that sometimes Levinas was looking very precisely what Professor Heidegger is doing. And it looks like he knew a lot of Heidegger was written in his lectures and not published, especially in the field of arts. It's evident that Levinas, for example, knew his Heidegger's courses on Hölderlin, on the essence of poetry, which were not published.
So what would be his access? How would he have access to that?
Sorry?
How would Levinas have access to that? Would there be students that would come back to Paris?
Kabbalistic access. I don't know the access, but maybe some students, but as probably you know, when I find out in La réalité son ombre, exactly Heidegger, not topics but phrases from non-published courses. So it looks like Levinas was into Heidegger, in spite of all the contradiction between Levinas as an imprisoned Jewish French officer and Heidegger as rector of respected fascist university. So that is definitely what I saw maybe before in this whole chapter of the dwelling, correlations with Heidegger, and especially with Heidegger idea of Vorhold, of this gathering together of four levels of sky and earth, of divinities and mortals. This gathering together, in my view, is something very close and very correlates too much to the whole concept of Levinas, le demeure, of dwelling, of house as gathering together, of house as concretization of being. So, in spite of certain differences between Levinas and Heidegger and so, of course, Levinas and Heidegger and Discus, these similarities looks quite sensible. The other topic, speaking exactly now about labors and body consciousness, the other topic that I wanted also to just to mention that as in totality and infinity as a whole, here Levinas writes about everything in a very aesthetical language. Very close to Blanchot in my view, and of course to Maurice of course. I mean exactly the kind of discourse. It's very close to phenomenology de la perception here in some parts. And that's a paradox for me. Levinas all time speaks about aesthetical phenomenon. I mean the face, the proximity of face. Even he elaborates the face in terms of painting, shadows of face, etc., etc. He speaks about dwelling, very architectural topic, etc., etc. He speaks about aesthetics, and step by step eliminates all these aesthetics, all the aesthetical meanings, step by step. The result is definitely la réalité, or the beginning is definitely la réalité sombre, these parts of the Resistance and Resistance, where Levinas speaks about limits of aesthetic. Now, these two paradoxes which I wanted to introduce into my, I would say, notes.
I'm thinking that one place he retains aesthetic language is in his approach to the Iliad, because he cannot approach the Iliad directly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it always is accounted for in this indirect aesthetic language. But you're right, he strips the others. Because think of all he says about the face, nowhere does he ever describe a face. It's like almost biblical. Right? No, we know of no face in the Bible. There's a famous line that he said, which is funny. He had a great sense of humor when someone saw a portrait of Buber, Martin Buber, with a beard. He said, "Oh, he looks like a biblical prophet." And Levinas said, "We have no idea what biblical prophets look like." Right? Levinas really, I can understand the connection with Merleau-Ponty, and for me it's a very rich language, but in the end it loses its aesthetic.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
That's
what I'm saying. Speaking of biblical faces, it's a good topic, because I remember one of the papers by Kasuta, famous, I would say, rabbinical commentator of Genesis, very old paper, where he had to speak about this phenomena of voice in Bible. And one of his commentaries, these 5 volumes commentaries of Kasuta to Genesis, an outstanding commentary, very old, 1948, 1949. And he wrote that we could see their faces through their voices. So this very specific kind of seeing through hearing, biblical mode, perception, biblical mode perception. So in my view, Levinas sometimes works with the face aesthetically, but I will not concentrate on this. So what I saw very interesting in this chapter, labels about the consciousness. First, it seems to me that when Levinas speaks about, let's say, proceeding from the dwelling, page number 163, when Levinas speaks about proceeding from the dwelling possession accomplished by the quasi-miraculous grasp of a scene in the night, in the upper realm of prime matter discovers the world, and then the grasp of a thing illuminates the very night of the Apiron. It looks like he introduces Apiron, so mostly early Greek philosophy notion of such unlimitedness, but probably mostly space unlimitedness. He introduces it like he introduced before Ilya in temporal dimensions. So here Peron, in my view, performs almost the same function in space dimension as Ilya in temporal dimension. And also this grasping of things arises, in my view, in a certain way like Lanstan, like a moment, like an instant, like an instant of separation, let's say, in the Aperon. This is a remark. Another remark which was very interesting for me, what furthermore Levinas says about contemplation. It's very difficult to understand, meanwhile, what he said about contemplation, not only here, but in different parts. So, in his view, it looks like contemplation in his paragraph here, I mean the same page, 163, means something like non-activity of subject. something. He writes, contemplation is not a suspension of the activity of man, it comes after the suspension of the chaotic and thus independent being of the element, and after the encounter of the other who calls in question possession itself. So it seems to me that he speaks about contemplation as a kind of not active and passive gathering together, if I understand clearly.
I'm thinking it's a direct confrontation with Heidegger. He's saying it's not from the, when he says the suspension of the activity of man, contemplation is not derived from the breakdown of the instrumental totality. As Heidegger would have us believe, that representation it becomes an object after it no longer functions, then I have to understand how to reproduce such an object, so I need a representation of it. Levinas is saying that, yes, in a sense it comes after praxis, only in the sense that praxis is the recollection that enables possession, that are then challenged by the existence of others. And once we bring in the others, then I'm required by that to a certain level of attention that leads to contemplation. So it's just another not a derivation, it's trying to see what it is that stimulates or raises up this kind of recollection that is contemplation, but not seeing it as simply the product of the breakdown of tools, I think.
Yeah, so that's interesting because here I find definitely direct opposition to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, direct opposition, because what Maurice Merleau-Ponty writes about contemplation, love, initiative, etc., and later on, and at the same time, exactly the same time of totalitarian theory, what Maurice Merleau-Ponty writes about contemplation in Le Doute de Cézanne is very active and very principled understanding of contemplation as a kind of visual philosophy, a kind of unique opportunity of the visual, to grasp and to penetrate the things. I mean, Maurice Merleau-Ponty approach to contemplation. And this approach Levinas attributes not to contemplation, but to, I will jump now a little bit further more. But to groping, and I would say to this very, in my view, very specific French word, tâtonnement in French text, because groping is exactly what constitutes the activity, the ability of body in the direction of possessing the world.
Beginning of the bottom of page 167.
167, yeah, 167. Because groping or tâtonnement is, in my view, a kind of projective attitude to possession. It does not take the object, it does not possess, in fact, the whole dwelling, the whole milieu, the whole space, but it's a very active, very projective attitude, which distinguishes, which marks human body. What Levinas writes here on human body is also very strong opposition both to Maurice Merleau-Ponty and both to Bataille, who wrote this year exactly on the topic of human body, or on the topic of body, because For Levinas, a principle is a body as he writes in page 166. The ambiguity of the body by which the eyes engage in the other but comes always from the higher side is produced in labor. So for him, bodiness, body is exactly what originates in labor. So graping in this case, dropping in this case is a kind of specific being of the body in its relation to dwelling. And this is exactly, I would say, activistic understanding of the body, in opposite to understanding of the body as a kind of media between everything, sensitive media between everything, in Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Lerotism of Georges Bataille. So these few ideas which were especially interesting for me in this small chapter, and I would probably stop here.
Thank you. The groping just seems to be part of Levinas's phenomenology of the hand, or trying to eliminate this notion of the ends. Ends are already somehow there and direct our movements, but like Merleau-Ponty, the movement toward and the finding are interrelated, and is not one before the other. So it's a good chronological account there. Let's see what else is there. Did anyone else have more to say about this section? Questions?
I have a problem with the concept of contemplation.
Oh, that's it.
I just can't understand how Levinas speaks in the same time about reaching, grasping with the hand, which is pretty much practical,
Yep.
and about contemplation. So he either he uses this word contemplation in a total different way that we are used to,
Yeah.
which is possible, or I can't make any sense of this idea.
So let's try to make sense of it. Because Aristotle would have us believe that contemplation begins in wonder, as if wonder just comes out of nowhere. And Levinas, in developing this genetic constitutional analysis of subjectivity, has shown us the way from the Iliad to the enjoyment that's carefree, then threatened by the uncontrolled, unregulated future, collecting itself in a movement that begins at the bodily level in terms of a place of collecting the collective being, embodied developing possessions, so that the first character of things are possessions. Mm-hmm. So once he gets the notion of possession, the notion that this is mine, he immediately thinks this could be contested. Like I said about the car, it's not yours except for those papers. Mm-hmm. So once the thing is a movable, a property, it then can be contested by the other. And for Levinas, I think what he's saying here is that contestation brings in the full force of the other. And that's going to awaken me to an attention that's going to require representation. That is, this object has a value, it can be exchanged, it occurs within a larger context that is not within the simple control of my body and my habitation. I am now in a network of relations. So if I'm not mistaken, and maybe we're building too much on this one section, that the notion of representation or contemplation is aroused by the other, of course, in relationship to property, in relation to the possession of property. Now, Nietzsche says the same thing. Nietzsche says that thinking arose as an economic relation, right? Of being in debt and not in debt. That's Nietzsche's theory. Thinking is calculation. Levinas is saying representation begins in the economy of possession. Now, fortunately for us, Levinas is not going to end in representation, right? But it's an interesting derivation of what stimulates us to be these reflexive thinking beings. No different than, well, in essence, no different than Nietzsche, but an entirely different context. Nietzsche just sort of pops it out of the blue because he's such a brilliant guy. But Levinas, in this genetic, constitutional analysis, derives it from that. And of course he's doing it in opposition to Heidegger. I mean, how else? I mean, it's not like he's deliberately saying, if Heidegger says A, I say B. He's just saying, Heidegger's the only guy who said anything about this of any significance, because he's the first guy to have utilized phenomenology in its existential, concrete way. I have no one else as an interlocutor. So it turns out I don't agree with the way Heidegger said contemplation begins. I don't think theory comes from the Platonic practice. But this is how I think theory begins. This is how I take it.
I think that on 109 there's a quote which supports what you're saying.
Oh, I'm so glad. I used to teach logic. The students would say, well, that's not what Irving Copey says. And then I would know, oh, I'm wrong. I'm just dead wrong. Because in logic, either you're right or you're wrong. Okay, thank you. Thank you. 109, let's see what's there.
Yeah, it's quickly. It says that the contemplation of objects remains close to action. So this connection between practicality.
Yeah.
It disposes of its theme and consequently comes into play on a plane where one being limits another. So I think that's one being limits another. That's what Richard was saying. About possession and economics in general.
So by contemplation, it looks like Levinas understands mostly visual contemplation. No?
Mostly what?
Visual contemplation or any kind of metaphysical.
He says on 172 that
well, I can't think about any other way of contemplation than the visual one.
You could.
Is theoria means precisely this.
It is also metaphysical. But yeah, so
He has some beautiful pages on Plato's image of the cave and the light. We could look at those.
So if he speaks exactly about visual contemplation, it looks quite evident that from visual contemplation to tactility, to grasping by hand. And in this case, possession means more intensive proximity and more intensive tactility in relation I and milieu.
But what's the relation between contemplation and this, what you call tactility? So how do they come together? Why does he need them both?
Yeah, it looks like Levinas has his own concept of this relationship because it's very different from Maurice MacLeod.
Yeah.
Very different.
Go to the top of page 171.
And it looks like that for him visual contemplation is first stage and more intensive possession is grasping by hand.
Okay. Yeah. But okay.
I'm just wondering, relate this to his statement on 172 that
Page 71.
170.
Oh, 170. Yeah, that's right.
171. That where is it? Contemplation is in contemplation brews idolatry.
What? Page 172.
I had it. No, it's lost. Where is it? Oh, okay. Yeah, 172. About 3/4 of the way down the page. Paragraph begins, but the transcendence of the phase is not enacted outside the world, as through the economy by which separation is produced remain beneath the sort of beatific contemplation of the other, which would thereby turn into the idolatry that brews in all contemplation.
let's go back one bit to get back to what you said, okay? Top of page 171. In order that I be able to see things in themselves, and this will, Cindy will come back to this about phenomena and being, to see things, that is, once I have property that can be contested by the other, I have to, for the first time, see it as the other sees it. Right? What is it that the other see? So when in order that I be able to see things in themselves, that is, represent them to myself, refuse both enjoyment and possession. In other words, I could be dispossessed by the other. That is, it's not just a matter of enjoyment. It's potentially the other will take this from me. I must see what it is. But in order to see what it is, I represent it to myself, refuse enjoyment and possession, I must know how to give what I possess. That is, this is no longer itself, in and of itself, mine, because with the mineness comes phenomenality. But in the sense of the objectivity of it, it's not mine. It can be gifted to the other. I have to see, what is this thing? Even though I think it's this wonderful thing, I can give it to the other. And I'm going to see how the other sees. How does the other see it? Right? I think, so the industry face of the other, because now he's setting us up to move on to the face of the other. The industry face of the other calls me into question, the absolutely other, blah, 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 blah. Now, let's go to what Jim has pointed out.
But how can I give something I don't possess?
Yeah, you do possess it, but the other, as other, contests your possession of it. So you now can see what you possess objectively as how the other would see it. And now that you see it objectively, and there is the other already who's contesting it, is now something, because the other as other comes always as obligation. And obligation means giving and receiving. I give. The relation to the other is giving. That's the original relation to the other. You don't come to the other living houses with empty hands. Here I can tell you a personal story. We were in the car coming back from Sarasila Sahal. I had the privilege of being with Levinas, and with Jacques Roland, also one of the greatest of Levinas scholars, unfortunately died early. And Jacques Roland, who saw himself almost as a son to Levinas, had warned me. He said, Levinas doesn't want to hear Yiddish. Don't talk Yiddish. Not that I can even speak it, but I know a few words. And so somehow we were talking philosophy, surprise, and Levinas said Heidegger has only two forms of the hand, the ready to hand and the present to hand, and he didn't refer to groping then, Levinas. He said what Heidegger doesn't have is the hand that begs. That's very interesting, right? So there's no hand that begs, and that's the hand that Levinas is interested in. The other always comes as, remember, height and destitution. So I said in Yiddish, I said, there's a word for that in Yiddish, the hand that begs, the friend that said, oh, the schnorrer. You know, the schnorrer. And Levinas loved it. He laughed. He said, yeah, schnorrer. You know, so poor Jacques Roland was wrong. So yes. That is, once the other comes to contest the possession, and now I'm in the contact with the full other, the non-discrete other, what is put into play is the obligation I have to that other, and that obligation is concrete for Levinas. It's not just good intentions, it's giving. You come to the other with gifts, with giving. And we all know that. Anyway, that's how I would answer that. I want to get to what Jim was saying about idols. What was that on page 172? Because remember, everything can always turn into its opposite, right? Nothing is, you know. Oh, here, no face. Page 172. No face can be approached with empty hands and closed home. Recollection in a home open to the other. Hospitality is the concrete and initial fact of human recollection and separation. It coincides with desire for the other, absolute transcendence. The chosen home is the very opposite of a root. That is the vegetative theory. It's the disengagement, a wandering, And the image, of course, in Judaism is the Abraham at his tent. Abraham sits at his tent, which is open for strangers, and he sees strangers, and he gets up to feed them. The angels, as it were, but they're really just humans in the biblical story. And immediately they slaughter an animal, they feed them, he washes their feet. Abraham is the character of hospitality. That's his status in Judaism. It's like, different people have different characteristics. Isaac is a judgmental figure, but Abraham is known for hospitality, which is why he has this confrontation with the people of Sodom. Because the people of Sodom, although we now think of them as Sodomites, the actual problem with Sodom is inhospitality. That's the crime of Sodom. They are a successful city, they are a wealthy city, and they do not share. So when strangers come to town, you're not allowed to put them up in your house. That's why everyone's upset with Lot, because when the angel or person comes to visit him, he puts him up in his house. And the people of Sodom go nuts, because if someone starts being hospitable, the whole thing collapses, because we're successful, we have everything. We don't want strangers to come and take it, right? So you can't do that. That's the story of Sodom. And Lot then is hospitable because he is related to Abraham. Right? That's the saving grace of Lot. He's related to Abraham. Of course, he's a pretty twisted version of hospitality, as we know, if you know that story. And, the things he does to satisfy the mob. So the image here of the hospitality. One has to have something to give. One has to be a recollective being to give. But once one has the recollection, once one is already under the obligation to give. To have is to need to give, is to have to give. Now the thing is, of course, even if you have nothing, now Professor Lingus tells beautiful stories of giving people who have already themselves nothing, and yet they give. Right? So that these stories shame us. Lingus tells these stories on purpose to shame us, and he's right. We should be ashamed. People who have nothing are still giving. Right? And we who have so much are selfish. Right? So let's go back. See, I'm already into Thursday today. I can't control myself. The morrow is coming in. So let's go back to the thing that Jim said. Middle of page 172, but the transcendence of the face is not enacted outside the world, as though the economy by which separation is produced remained beneath a sort of beatific contemplation of the other. That's that Greek attitude, right? Practical life. It's for slaves and women, right? It's that Greek haughtiness. And you see it in Heidegger, only two languages are philosophical. Greek and German. Sense. There he does. He's the student of Heidegger. He's a disciple of Heidegger. So, which would thereby turn into the idolatry that brews in all contemplation. So what is that idolatry that brews in all contemplation that the Greeks succumb to the extent that they disdain practical life? It's not worth it. It's meaningless. The hunger of people. You see it in Spinoza. Right? The good and evil that ordinary people believe in is only an illusion of ignoramuses. We who know the truth are not moved by good and evil, justice and injustice. You tell me of injustices. Ignorant men. Right? That would be a truly Spinozistic response. So you don't sully yourself with this sort of stuff. So the idolatry of contemplation is that this is worth so much more than this trivial business of your hunger. Well, that's idolatry, right? To let people starve in the name of your contemplation. Right? I don't. I think we're having a good interactive discussion in terms of Levinas and Heidegger, so I don't want to poison the well. But I feel that some of the veneration that Heidegger allowed around his thinking was a form of this idolatry, the haughtiness of thought.
That's true.
Yeah.
Well, there's
What?
But I was thinking, you know, in relation just to the idea of representation, Bergson does this too. You know, originally the idea that you create in the development reveals the world to you, but then you turn around and start thinking about the idea that actually becomes a barrier to the world. And Buber does this in Eclipse of God too. What originally reveals God to me eventually becomes an idol. Because I start worshiping my idea of God instead of God.
Sure.
And then in this, you know,
the ceremony of the set. The ceremony of the set.
Levinas is famous. You know, I always come too late for the other. I develop an image of the other, and then I start thinking the other is my image and not the face of the other. So always in contemplation, there is this danger of idolatry.
Right.
Well, I think there's an antinomy which is present in the whole history of philosophy, and this is the antinomy between contemplation and practical life. Between this is in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, can be this is this as clear as it can possibly be, and Aristotle is confronted with this difficulty, because this ethics, his Nicomachean Ethics, has actually two parts. It is one part which is the large, which is the most part of the book, where he speaks about virtues, yeah, where he speaks about moral virtues, where he speaks about how to treat the other, how to have a beautiful life among the others. Because, as you've said, ethics is just a preparation for the politics to come. But there's one single chapter in this ethics where Aristotle says that the culmination of happiness, the culmination of a happy life, of eudaimonia, is in contemplation. And this is a contradiction in Aristotle ethics.
No question. The question of whether you need friends.
He cannot, yeah, precisely. The question is, he would say that this is the life of gods. The life of gods is the contemplation. As closer you come to this life of God, as happier you are. And this is something to which Socrates had a very good answer, because Socrates is not the philosopher to write stuff and to isolate himself the way Heidegger does, for example, and to refuse the presence of the others, but is somebody who wants to torment the Athenians, who want to bother them with all kinds of questions. And there's a beautiful dialogue, Philo, where his disciples ask him, "And what are we going to do now when you're going to be dead? To whom are we going to talk? To whom are we going to speak philosophy?" And Socrates gives them the most beautiful answer. And I think, this is for me. This is the heritage of philosophy, which was forgotten. And Socrates tells them, you should go and find other people, and even barbarians, and talk to them. So this is what philosophy is about. Philosophy is not about contemplation. It's not about retreating yourself in your Einsamkeit, your Vereinzelung, but it's about finding other people in order to find yourself. Let's not forget the fact that the philosophy was born at the margins of the Greek civilization. There where the Greeks encountered the otherness. Yeah, it was born in Milet, in Turkey. It was born in that what now is Italy. So it wasn't born in Athens. It was born at the margins. Born there where they come in contact with the others. And this is the heritage that was utterly lost in the.
Now I better understand Kant living in Königsberg. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And this conflict has tormented philosophy from its beginnings. In American philosophy, the philosopher who rants most eloquently against this is Dewey. Dewey has no truck with this separation of contemplation and praxis. And he always signs for their integrality. And he had a real effect on the American educational system with that idea. Because until recently, there was a separation of people who were going into the arts and sciences and people going into practical fields. There still is, but in the American educational system, you really do everything together until you go to university. It's a very different approach.
So, and Risha, in European philosophical cultural heritage of Renaissance and later time, there's two modes, vita activa and vita contemplativa,
Yes.
which are all time interrelated. Because, for example, I will go to case from art, sorry for that. For example, in Renaissance concept of living, of habitation, in Italian Renaissance concept of habitation, it was necessary for a proper person, or a distinguished person, to have two modes of living, vita activa, so to have exactly as Don Battista Alberti teaches us, to have exactly house inside the city. He exactly writes vita activa, and the other vita contemplativa, to have outside villa, and
The dacha.
the dacha, yeah, and like. And the whole 15th, 16th, 17th century concept of life is all time between vita activa, vita contemplativa. And here, in Levinas, in this chapter, it's page number 163 again. It's exactly what is vita contemplativa. Paradisal enjoyment. That's vita contemplativa. Exactly on this page, timeless and carefree. That's exactly the characteristic of vita contemplativa. The last paragraph, 163.
Oh, really? Because it's
Paradisal
a very different
enjoyment.
way here. Interesting.
Timeless and carefree. And
Wouldn't the word leisure be the appropriate word? Leisure.
Sorry?
Leisure.
yeah,
Okay.
The metaphor for that is the Villa Rotonda, perhaps.
Villa Rotonda, in fact, is a combination of vita activa and vita contemplativa.
Really?
Palladio concept, sorry, the details. Palladio describes it in Quattro Vite Therapy. Exactly, combination of these two modes.
So there are many temptations of the intellectual life. One is to think that it's simply superior to practical life. The other is to believe that it has absorbed the conditions of its own possibility, right? And then become a tyrant in the world of ideas. Because then you have to eliminate the real world. The world of ideas is the true world. You have to eliminate, and Plato knows very well that when Socrates, when you come back into the cave, they're not going to be very happy with you. Right. So, shall we take a? Is there more on this? We want to go further. So Levinas is not one to take the side of contemplation, but he began this whole section making sure we understood that his view was not an anti-intellectualist position. Right? His route out is not anti-intellectual. That is, Levinas's position will require the greatest sobriety of thinking. It will require intelligence. It will require science and knowledge, but it will not be this aristocratic, haughty, contemplative disdain for the real world. So then we better understand why he's cautioning him not. He's not anything. Because the classic route out of that distinction is to go with anti-intellectualism. That's the classic, that's the romantic route out. And Levinas is not taking the romantic route out. Okay. So let's take a break, and we'll come back, and we'll do more.